Okay, so I want to talk a little bit more about implied premises and, just how we diagram them. Lavin's pretty good on this, but I just want to go through it, right? So let's look at the argument looked at before. Dick goes on and on about his IQ score, implied premise. Most people who go on and on about their IQ scores have not accomplished anything in life. Conclusion, I should put so or therefore, whatever. It is very likely that Dick has not accomplished anything in life, right? How would we diagram this? Well, when we put an implied premise, we should distill first. When you distill, just label it as an implied premise, right? Just label it. Let me know what's going on. How do we represent this when we diagram? Well, that's not super complicated either. Um, Remember, implied premises are almost pretty much all cases. And there might be some exceptions, but usually they're going to be conjoint support, right? So how do we represent that? Well, remember for our conjoint support, we have our little bracket. But how do we fill in a missing premise? It would be, kind of distracting, especially because diagrams can get pretty busy. It would be distracting to always label it. So I think, this convention Lavin has where we use sort of dashed lines to represent an implied premise that we filled in. I think that's a pretty good one, right? So that's how we would fill this one in. All right. Going on down the list, let me give you guys a few more examples. So, Colonel Mustard didn't commit the murder. Miss Scarlet didn't commit the murder. So Reverend Green committed the murder, right? What would make this argument work? Well, that it was one of these three, right? If it's not these other two, that doesn't mean anything about Green doing it, but if it's not these other two and it was him or one of those two, well, definitely he did it, right? So implied premise, Mustard, Scarlet, Green, one of them committed the murder. Wasn't him, wasn't her, so it was the good reference, right? So how would we fill this in? Well, pretty simple. These are all premises on the same level, three premises working together to prove a conclusion, conjoint support, right? So, if I were going to diagram this one, I would just sketch all three of these out, right? Give this a second to load. You know, Mustard didn't do it. Scarlet didn't do it. Well, it was one of these three. That's our implied premise. We put in the dotted lines. All three of these working together show that, in fact, the Reverend did it, right? I guess in early versions of Clue, they just called him Mr. Green because they thought Americans would be scandalized that a Reverend might be the murderer, right? Clue was invented in England. I guess maybe they have a lower opinion of clergymen than they thought we do. I think he's Reverend Green in like the editions now, make of that whatever you will, right? Whatever sociological fact. All right. Sorry, I'm going to use a lot of examples from Clue because, as I said, when I was a kid, the power went out a lot. We played a lot of Clue by Lantern Light, right? So, whatever. Pretty good at illustrating stuff, though. All right, so let's look at a few more. Just a few more things to note about implied premises. A lot of times, missing premises will be an if-then statement. You know, murder was committed with a lead pipe, so it was mustard. Well, what will we fill in? If the murder was committed with a lead pipe, it was mustard. All or no, also fairly common, and either or statements, right? Scarlet didn't do it, so green did. Well, either Scarlet did it or green did, right? Wasn't committed in the library, so it was committed in the greenhouse. Either it was the greenhouse or the library, right? These are very common ways to fill in missing premises. Sometimes it'll just be a statement of fact, but a lot of times it'll be if-then statements or either-or statements. So if you're wondering how to fill in, I think if-then, all, no, either-or are often good starting points. We'll talk a lot more about the logic of these statements when we get to formal logic. Let me just give you guys one more couple levels on this. Henry is on the math quiz team, so he must be good at math. He ought to become an engineer. There's a couple missing premises here, a couple implied premises, and a couple levels, right? He is on the math quiz team. People on the math quiz team are almost always good at math. The implied premise could do everyone on the math quiz team is good at math, but I think this implied almost always a little better. Henry's very likely good at math. People who are good at math should become engineers, right? Two implied premises. Let's fill this in for each level, right? So how would we diagram it? I think our diagram would look something like this. For this to load, he's on the math quiz team. So he's probably good at math. And that's 3. Then we need to add to 3 this idea that, well, people who are good at math should be engineers, right? So arguments with missing premises can be a bit complicated. Implied premises, 2 with 1 to get you 3, 3 with the implied premise of 4 to get you 5, right? So hopefully you guys are getting a better idea how this works and how to diagram it. And I will say, sometimes if you're wondering what the missing premise is, the implied premise, a lot of times you might start diagramming it to start with and see where you think, well, there should be conjoint support here and there isn't. If you're having trouble thinking if there is a missing premise or what it might be, that is a good place, a good way to go about it, a good place to start. Okay, so we can stop there with this. I hope this is just giving you guys a better idea of what's going on here, how this works.